December 16, 1944, 5:30 hours. Ardennes Forest, near Monshaw. Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson stood beside his artillery command post as the frozen ground trembled under the opening barrage of Operation Wacht am Rhein. German guns were firing at a rate approaching 1,600 rounds per minute across an 85-mile front, and through the gray winter haze came the first waves of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division advancing toward American lines. Axelson watched as shells screamed overhead, but something unprecedented followed. The explosions did not strike the earth. They burst in the air, precisely above the advancing formations, scattering lethal fragments downward in expanding cones of steel. German veterans who had survived Stalingrad and Kursk suddenly found their instincts useless. Trenches offered no protection, trees became splintered shrapnel, and even prone soldiers were cut down where they lay. Axelson had just ordered the use of proximity-fuzed artillery shells without authorization, deploying a classified technology that had never been intended for ground combat. He did not yet know that within hours, this decision would alter the entire dynamics of the Ardennes offensive, and within days, rewrite the mathematics of battlefield lethality itself. At that moment, German command believed in one decisive truth. The Ardennes offensive would succeed through surprise, concentration, and speed. Nearly 200,000 troops, 1,000 tanks, and close to 2,000 artillery pieces had been assembled under strict secrecy, concealed in forests and fog to avoid Allied reconnaissance. Hitler's directive was clear: break through the thinly held American lines, split British and American forces, and seize Antwerp within weeks. Intelligence reports suggested the sector was weakly defended by inexperienced units and exhausted formations rotated for rest. The logic appeared sound. German doctrine had proven repeatedly that shock, mass, and rapid exploitation could shatter even numerically superior enemies. With weather grounding Allied aircraft and initial bombardments achieving total surprise, commanders believed the offensive would replicate the early victories of 1940. On paper, the situation appeared nearly ideal. The German system combined concentrated artillery, armored spearheads, and infantry assault waves designed for breakthrough warfare. The opening barrage alone delivered thousands of shells within minutes, while forward units advanced under cover of fog and limited visibility. American defenses in this sector consisted of scattered reconnaissance elements such as the 38th Cavalry Squadron, lacking heavy armor and prepared for a quiet winter front rather than a full-scale offensive. German calculations assumed that such units would collapse quickly under pressure, allowing panzer divisions to exploit the breach. Every operational estimate pointed toward rapid penetration, miles gained within hours, not days. But within minutes of the first assaults, reports began to emerge that did not align with these expectations. Advancing units encountered artillery fire that behaved unlike anything previously experienced. Shells detonated above ground level, striking soldiers regardless of cover. Trees exploded into lethal splinters, trenches filled with downward falling fragments, and even dispersed formations suffered catastrophic losses. Some officers initially assumed new timing errors or experimental munitions, while others suspected airburst adjustments by forward observers. Yet the precision was too consistent, too immediate, and too widespread to be explained by conventional methods. Then the scale of the effect became undeniable. Entire platoons disappeared within seconds under overlapping airbursts. Not dozens, not isolated casualties. Hundreds of soldiers were cut down in minutes across multiple sectors. Veterans who had survived years on the Eastern Front reported that no known defensive technique could counter this type of fire. The battlefield itself had changed. No terrain feature offered protection. No formation reduced risk. The weapon did not require direct hits. It transformed the air into a killing field. With each passing hour, the situation deteriorated further for the advancing German forces. Reports from the front described a battlefield that no longer obeyed established rules of combat. Assault waves that should have overwhelmed light American defenses instead dissolved under invisible detonations above their heads. Units attempting to regroup behind tree lines suffered even heavier losses as shattered branches multiplied the lethal radius of each explosion. Communications began to fragment as officers struggled to explain casualties that could not be linked to direct fire or visible artillery adjustment. What had begun as a calculated offensive was rapidly becoming an uncontrolled attritional disaster. The core problem revealed itself quickly. German forces possessed numbers, experience, and offensive doctrine refined over years of war. They had concentrated nearly 200,000 troops and thousands of guns for a decisive breakthrough. But the American side now wielded a technological advantage that multiplied every shell's effectiveness far beyond traditional calculations. Proximity fuses transformed standard artillery into a weapon capable of covering areas up to 50 times larger than conventional impact shells. While German artillery required precision and observation, American guns could deliver devastating fire without adjustment, in darkness, fog, or forest terrain. This was no longer a contest of maneuver versus defense. It was a confrontation between conventional firepower and industrially amplified lethality. At the center of this shift stood Axelson's decision. In that moment of crisis near Monshaw, he recognized what higher command had not yet accepted. Conventional artillery would fail against the scale of the German assault. The proximity fuse, previously restricted to anti-aircraft use due to fears of capture, offered the only means to break the attack before American lines collapsed. His unauthorized order bypassed doctrine, security protocols, and direct command authority. Yet the immediate results left no ambiguity. German momentum halted. Assault formations stalled. The offensive, designed to advance miles within hours, slowed to a crawl within the first day. Within days, the implications became impossible to ignore. By December 19th, reports of the weapon's effectiveness reached Supreme Headquarters, and General Eisenhower authorized its widespread use across the Ardennes. By December 21st, restrictions were lifted entirely, and proximity-fused shells began arriving in large quantities to artillery units throughout the sector. What began as a localized, unauthorized deployment expanded into a theater-wide transformation of firepower. Units such as the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion and the 969th Artillery Battalion integrated the new shells into defensive operations, creating zones of fire that no infantry assault could penetrate. The turning point came as German commanders began to understand what they were facing. This was not an isolated anomaly or experimental ammunition. It was a systematic capability backed by American industry. Production had already reached 40,000 fuses per day, with over 100 companies contributing to manufacturing. Each shell contained more than 130 electronic components, miniature radar systems capable of detecting proximity and triggering detonation at optimal height. The weapon functioned reliably despite acceleration forces of 20,000 G and extreme temperature variations, achieving operational reliability above 80%. The scale of production ensured that this was not a limited advantage. It was sustainable, expandable, and overwhelming. By late December, the outcome was effectively decided. German units attempting river crossings, forest maneuvers, or massed assaults suffered catastrophic losses before even reaching American lines. At the Sauer River, a single battalion lost 702 men in minutes under proximity-fused bombardment. At Elsenborn Ridge, approximately 40,000 such shells accounted for a majority of over 5,000 German casualties within 3 days. The offensive that had been intended to split Allied forces instead consumed German reserves at a rate they could not replace. By January 25, 1945, the Ardennes offensive had collapsed, with German losses reaching approximately 100,000 casualties, while the strategic situation remained unchanged. This episode revealed a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Victory was no longer determined solely by tactical skill, surprise, or even operational planning. The decisive factor lay in the integration of science, industry, and battlefield adaptation. The proximity fuse demonstrated that a single technological breakthrough, produced at scale and deployed effectively, could neutralize numerical advantage and reshape the outcome of entire campaigns. War had entered a new phase, one where innovation and production defined the limits of possibility, and where the side capable of industrializing lethality would ultimately prevail. As the weapon spread across the Ardennes, its effects compounded beyond immediate battlefield losses. At Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division was encircled between December 19th and 31st, artillery units firing proximity-fused shells transformed a desperate defensive position into a lethal perimeter. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion alone fired 7,676 rounds during the siege, while heavier 155mm guns from supporting units created overlapping airburst zones that shattered every organized German assault. Infantry advancing across snow-covered fields were cut down before reaching effective range, entire platoons collapsing under fragment patterns that left no gaps. German prisoners later described attacks disintegrating before contact, as cohesion broke under fire that could not be predicted or avoided. In forest terrain, the effect intensified further. The Ardennes, chosen by German planners for concealment and maneuver, became a multiplier of destruction. Airburst shells detonating at 30 to 50 feet shattered tree canopies into thousands of high-velocity wooden splinters, turning natural cover into lethal fragmentation sources. Positions that had protected soldiers for generations, foxholes under roots, cover behind trunks, dispersed formations, became ineffective. A single 155mm shell could clear an area the size of a tennis court, combining steel fragments with wooden projectiles in a 360-degree kill zone. German tactical doctrine, built on dispersion and terrain use, offered no solution. Every adaptation increased vulnerability somewhere else. The technological foundation behind this transformation revealed an even deeper imbalance. Each proximity fuse functioned as a miniature radar system operating at frequencies between 180 and 220 MHz, emitting signals that reflected off terrain, equipment, and human bodies. As the shell approached its target, signal strength increased until reaching a threshold corresponding to optimal detonation height, triggering an electronic switch. Inside each unit, engineers had integrated over 130 components, including vacuum tubes miniaturized to the size of pencil erasers, capable of surviving acceleration forces of 20,000 G and rotational stresses during flight. The system worked in temperatures ranging from 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit at firing to sub-zero conditions at trajectory peak, maintaining reliability above 80% under combat conditions. German intelligence, despite capturing approximately 20,000 such shells, failed to grasp the mechanism in time. Technical teams dismissed the devices as impossible, unable to reconcile the presence of fragile electronics with artillery launch conditions. Some concluded the visible components were decoys, others theorized magnetic triggers or unknown physical principles. This misinterpretation delayed any countermeasure development during the critical weeks of the offensive. Ironically, Germany had possessed working prototypes before the war, developed by firms such as Rheinmetall Borsig and AEG, but these programs had been cancelled under directives prioritizing short-term production. By late 1944, German engineers were only months away from operational deployment, too late to influence the battlefield. The industrial scale behind the weapon proved equally decisive. By December 1944, American factories were producing proximity fuses at a rate of 1 unit every 2 seconds, with total wartime output reaching 22 million units. Over 100 companies contributed to production, from major electronics firms to converted civilian manufacturers. Costs dropped from $732 per unit in 1942 to $18 through mass production, enabling widespread deployment without logistical constraint. Approximately 200,000 shells were used during the Battle of the Bulge alone, ensuring that the technological advantage was not limited or temporary but sustained across the entire front. The final phase of the battle confirmed the strategic consequences. On January 1, 1945, during Operation Bodenplatte, German aircraft encountered proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire that destroyed 172 of 277 lost aircraft in a single day, crippling the Luftwaffe's remaining strength in the west. Ground offensives stalled completely as artillery dominance prevented concentration of forces. By January 25, the German retreat was irreversible. The Ardennes offensive had failed not only because of resistance, but because the fundamental balance of warfare had shifted. German forces faced an enemy capable of applying scientific innovation directly to combat at scale, transforming every shell into a force multiplier. The lesson that emerged was stark. Courage, experience, and even operational surprise could not compensate for a gap in technological and industrial capacity. The proximity fuse did not act alone. It represented the convergence of research, manufacturing, logistics, and battlefield adaptation into a single system. From that winter in the Ardennes onward, warfare would no longer be decided solely by maneuver or numbers, but by the ability to integrate science into destruction faster and more effectively than the enemy. Beyond the battlefield, the psychological impact of this weapon spread rapidly through German ranks. Soldiers who had endured years of combat on the Eastern Front began to report a new kind of fear, one not tied to visible enemies or known weapons, but to an invisible mechanism that seemed to anticipate their movements. Traditional instincts, take cover, disperse, dig in, no longer guaranteed survival. Units began hesitating before advancing, delaying attacks, or breaking formation under fire that could not be predicted. In some sectors, officers reported that men preferred to remain exposed and moving rather than seek cover that offered no protection against airburst fragmentation. The weapon did not just kill, it disrupted decision-making at every level. This erosion of confidence extended upward through the German command structure. Field reports described artillery that required no observation, functioned in all weather, and produced casualty rates far exceeding previous engagements. Commanders attempting to coordinate attacks found their timetables collapsing as units failed to reach objectives or suffered heavy losses before contact. At Elsenborn Ridge, repeated assaults by elite SS Panzer units were halted not by defensive lines alone, but by sustained proximity-fused artillery fire that eliminated entire companies within minutes. Approximately 40,000 such shells contributed to over 5,000 casualties in just 3 days, forcing the abandonment of repeated offensive efforts in one of the key sectors of the battle. Attempts to adapt proved ineffective. Spreading formations reduced vulnerability to single explosions but exposed troops to wider fragmentation zones. Concentrating forces for breakthrough increased the risk of catastrophic losses from simultaneous detonations. Night movement, long used to avoid air power and observation, no longer provided safety, as the fuses required no visual targeting. Weather, once an advantage for German operations, became irrelevant. Fog, snow, and darkness concealed movement from aircraft, but not from radar-triggered artillery shells. The operational environment itself had been neutralized as a factor. At the same time, American forces integrated the new capability into coordinated fire doctrines. Time-on-target barrages, multiple batteries firing so shells arrived simultaneously, combined with proximity fuses to create concentrated airburst fields that maximized lethality. In the final week of December, General Patton's Third Army fired approximately 50,000 proximity-fused shells while advancing to relieve Bastogne, using synchronized artillery strikes to break resistance and reopen supply corridors. The result was not gradual attrition but sudden collapse of defensive pockets, as German units faced overwhelming firepower delivered in seconds rather than sustained over time. The cumulative effect became clear by early January 1945. German forces had lost operational momentum, suffered tens of thousands of casualties, and failed to achieve strategic objectives despite initial surprise and concentration. The offensive, intended to split Allied armies and seize Antwerp, instead exhausted Germany's remaining reserves in the west. By the time of withdrawal, approximately 200,000 proximity-fused shells had been used in the campaign, accounting for an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 German casualties, up to 20% of total losses, while requiring fewer adjustments, less observation, and less time than conventional artillery. The broader implication extended beyond the Ardennes. The proximity fuse represented a shift in how war would be fought, away from reliance on human observation and toward autonomous systems capable of sensing and reacting in real time. Its development required coordination between scientific research institutions, such as Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, and industrial networks capable of producing complex electronic devices at scale. This combination of innovation and production created a feedback loop. New technology could be rapidly deployed, tested in combat, and expanded across entire theaters within weeks. By the end of the war, military analysts on both sides reached similar conclusions. German commanders acknowledged that the weapon had neutralized key advantages in terrain, experience, and tactical doctrine. American leadership recognized that such technologies could shorten wars by increasing lethality and reducing prolonged engagements. The proximity fuse became the foundation for future developments: guided munitions, radar systems, and autonomous targeting mechanisms, marking the beginning of a new era in warfare where machines would increasingly determine the conditions of combat. The final phase of the Ardennes campaign revealed the full strategic weight of what had occurred. By January 25, 1945, German forces had been pushed back to their original positions, leaving behind destroyed equipment, abandoned artillery, and shattered formations that could no longer be reconstituted. Approximately 100,000 German casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, marked the cost of the failed offensive, while American losses reached around 75,000, including 19,000 dead. Yet the disparity was not simply numerical. German losses represented irreplaceable manpower and equipment, while American forces continued to receive reinforcements, supplies, and ammunition at a rate that exceeded consumption. The offensive had not only failed, it had accelerated Germany's strategic exhaustion. Among senior German commanders, the conclusion was unmistakable. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt later stated that the decisive factor in the battle was not merely Allied resistance, but artillery that seemed to have eyes, a direct reference to proximity-fused shells. General Otto von Manschafel reported that these airburst detonations caused panic even among experienced troops, breaking cohesion before engagements could fully develop. The weapon's effectiveness lay not only in its lethality, but in its ability to disrupt the fundamental relationship between soldier and battlefield. War had ceased to be a contest of positioning and had become a contest against systems that operated beyond human reaction. For the Allies, the implications extended far beyond a single victory. The proximity fuse demonstrated that scientific innovation, when combined with industrial capacity and rapid deployment, could produce decisive advantages independent of traditional factors such as terrain or numerical superiority. It validated a model of warfare in which research institutions, manufacturing networks, and frontline units operated as a unified system. The result was not just improved weapons, but an accelerated cycle of adaptation that allowed new technologies to influence ongoing operations almost immediately. At the human level, the cost remained immense. German soldiers, many of them young conscripts in the final stages of the war, faced weapons that rendered their training obsolete. American factory workers, often unaware of what they were producing, sustained relentless production schedules under strict secrecy, contributing to a system that transformed scientific theory into battlefield reality. The connection between laboratory and frontline had never been so direct, nor so consequential. The legacy of the proximity fuse extended into the post-war world. The miniaturization of electronic components, developed to survive extreme conditions inside artillery shells, became foundational for later advances in electronics, radar systems, and guided weapons. Engineers such as James Van Allen would carry these innovations into peacetime research, contributing to space exploration and satellite technology. The concept of a weapon capable of sensing its environment and acting autonomously became the basis for modern precision-guided munitions, fundamentally altering military doctrine in the decades that followed. This episode ultimately revealed a simple but decisive truth. Wars were no longer determined solely by courage, leadership, or even operational brilliance. They were shaped by the ability to convert knowledge into power, rapidly, efficiently, and at scale. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the introduction of proximity-fused artillery marked the moment when warfare fully entered the technological age, where the side that could industrialize innovation would hold the decisive advantage. What followed in Normandy and across Europe confirmed that the shift seen in the Ardennes was not temporary. It was irreversible. Artillery, once dependent on observation, weather, and human correction, had become an autonomous system of destruction. The proximity fuse removed uncertainty from one of war's most important variables: timing. Shells no longer relied on impact or imperfect calculations. They sensed, adjusted, and detonated at the precise moment of maximum effect. This single innovation multiplied the efficiency of every artillery unit in the Allied arsenal without increasing the number of guns or crews. For German forces, the implications extended beyond the Battle of the Bulge. Every future engagement now carried the risk of encountering weapons that ignored terrain, concealment, and traditional defensive measures. Forests, urban cover, trenches. None provided reliable protection against airburst fragmentation. The battlefield itself had become transparent to technology. Even experienced units, trained over years of combat, found their knowledge increasingly irrelevant against systems that operated according to physics rather than human expectation. At the operational level, this transformation accelerated the collapse of German resistance in the West. As Allied armies advanced toward the Rhine in early 1945, artillery equipped with proximity fuses ensured that German counterattacks could rarely mass sufficient force to achieve breakthroughs. Assault formations were disrupted before reaching assembly points, supply movements were targeted without precise observation, and defensive positions could be neutralized with fewer rounds and less time. The cumulative effect reduced Germany's ability to conduct coordinated operations, forcing a transition from organized defense to fragmented resistance. Meanwhile, American industry continued to expand production without interruption. The ability to manufacture complex electronic devices at scale, while simultaneously producing aircraft, tanks, and ammunition, demonstrated a level of industrial integration unmatched by any opponent. Each proximity fuse represented not just a technological achievement, but a logistical triumph. Raw materials, precision engineering, quality control, and distribution coordinated across hundreds of facilities and delivered to the front within days. This system ensured that innovation did not remain theoretical. It became operational immediately and in overwhelming quantities. By the final months of the war, the disparity between the two sides had become absolute. German forces faced an enemy capable of sustaining continuous pressure through a combination of firepower, supply, and technological adaptation. Even successful local actions could not alter the overall balance, as losses were replaced faster than they could be inflicted. The proximity fuse was one element within this larger system, but it symbolized the broader reality. The war had become a contest of production and innovation on a scale that individual battles could no longer influence. In retrospect, the events of December 1944 marked a decisive threshold. From Axelson's unauthorized order in the forests near Monschau to the widespread deployment of hundreds of thousands of shells across the Ardennes, the introduction of proximity-fused artillery demonstrated how quickly a single breakthrough could reshape an entire campaign. It was not merely a new weapon, it was evidence that the nature of war had changed permanently. Scientific advancement, once separate from the battlefield, had become its defining force, determining not only how wars were fought, but who would ultimately win them. In the aftermath, military analysts would look back on the Ardennes not simply as Germany's last offensive, but as the moment when the balance of warfare shifted irreversibly toward technology-driven dominance. The proximity fuse had demonstrated that lethality could be engineered, scaled, and deployed faster than any opponent could adapt. It removed the margin of error from artillery and replaced it with calculated certainty. Where once thousands of shells might be required to achieve a desired effect, now a fraction of that number could deliver greater destruction with higher efficiency. This was not an incremental improvement, it was a fundamental change in the relationship between firepower and outcome. For the German army, the experience left a lasting impression that extended into post-war doctrine. Officers who survived the Ardennes repeatedly emphasized that no amount of tactical skill could compensate for such disparities in technology and production. The battlefield had become an environment where scientific advantage translated directly into survival or annihilation. Units that could not counter or replicate such systems were effectively operating at a permanent disadvantage, regardless of training or experience. On the Allied side, the lesson was equally clear. The success of the proximity fuse validated a model of warfare built on integration, linking research institutions, industrial capacity, and frontline units into a single continuous system. Innovations were no longer isolated breakthroughs. They were components in a larger mechanism capable of reshaping entire campaigns within weeks. This approach would define not only the remainder of World War II, but the structure of military development in the decades that followed. The human dimension of this transformation remained complex. Behind every technological advance were thousands of individuals. Scientists working under secrecy, factory workers maintaining relentless production schedules, soldiers adapting to new realities under fire. The proximity fuse condensed these efforts into a single device, but its impact reflected the collective capacity of an entire system mobilized for war. It was not merely a weapon, it was the product of an industrial society applying its full capabilities to the battlefield. In the end, the story resolves into a broader historical conclusion. Wars are not won solely by tactics, bravery, or even leadership. They are decided by the ability to sustain, adapt, and innovate at scale. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, that truth became undeniable. The introduction of proximity-fused artillery marked the point at which warfare fully transitioned into the technological era, where victory belonged to those who could transform knowledge into overwhelming, repeatable power. The Ardennes had shown the immediate effect, but the deeper transformation continued unfolding as Allied forces pushed into Germany itself. Artillery units, now fully equipped with proximity fuses, operated with a level of confidence that fundamentally altered planning. Fire missions that once required careful observation, adjustment rounds, and favorable conditions could now be executed instantly, in darkness, fog, or urban terrain. The delay between detection and destruction collapsed to seconds. This compressed timeline meant that German movements, whether troop concentrations, supply columns, or counterattack formations, were increasingly detected and neutralized before they could develop into meaningful threats. German command structures, already strained by losses and communication breakdowns, faced an environment where reaction time was no longer sufficient to compensate for disadvantage. Orders issued hours in advance became obsolete by the time units attempted to execute them. Assembly areas were struck before attacks could begin. Reinforcements moving forward suffered casualties without ever engaging the enemy directly. The tempo of operations shifted beyond the limits of human coordination, driven instead by systems that operated continuously and without fatigue. At the same time, Allied forces refined the integration of artillery with other arms. Proximity-fused shells were used not only defensively but offensively, softening positions before infantry advances and isolating strongpoints by cutting off reinforcement routes. Combined with air superiority and overwhelming logistical support, this created layered pressure that German forces could not escape. Even when local resistance held temporarily, it did so under constant bombardment that eroded manpower, equipment, and morale simultaneously. The battlefield became a system of interconnected pressures rather than isolated engagements. By early 1945, the cumulative effect was visible across the Western Front. German units increasingly operated in fragmented conditions, lacking the ability to concentrate forces or sustain prolonged engagements. Artillery dominance ensured that any attempt at reorganization carried immediate risk. The traditional cycle of attack, defense, and counterattack broke down, replaced by a continuous process of attrition in which one side could absorb losses and adapt, while the other could not. The proximity fuse in this context was both a weapon and a signal. It demonstrated that warfare had reached a stage where technological systems could dictate the terms of engagement more decisively than individual commanders. The side that could integrate science into its operations, rapidly, reliably, and at scale, would shape not only battles but the entire course of the war. By the time Allied forces crossed the Rhine and advanced into the heart of Germany, the outcome was no longer in doubt. What remained was the final execution of a process already determined by imbalance. An imbalance not just of numbers or territory, but of capability. The Ardennes had revealed it. The final campaigns confirmed it. And the proximity fuse stood as one of the clearest examples of how that imbalance had been created and exploited. As the war moved into its final months, the lessons of the Ardennes were no longer theoretical. They were embedded into every Allied operation. Artillery doctrine had shifted permanently. Units no longer planned around uncertainty or limited observation. They planned around guaranteed effect. A target located was a target destroyed, often within minutes, regardless of terrain or weather. The proximity fuse eliminated one of the last unpredictable elements of indirect fire, turning artillery into a precise and dependable instrument of operational control. German forces, by contrast, entered 1945 with diminishing options. Their industry could not replicate the technology at scale, their logistics could not sustain comparable ammunition expenditure, and their command structure could not adapt quickly enough to counter its effects. Even where technical knowledge existed, production delays and resource shortages rendered it irrelevant. The gap between capability and necessity widened with each passing week, until it became unbridgeable. The battlefield itself reflected this imbalance. Positions that might once have held for days collapsed within hours under coordinated bombardment. Movement became increasingly dangerous, not because of enemy visibility, but because of the constant risk of unseen detection through technological means. The environment favored the side that could project power continuously, without pause, and without reliance on favorable conditions. In this system, endurance was no longer defined by individual resilience, but by the capacity to sustain output: shells, fuel, replacements, and innovation. By the time Germany capitulated in May 1945, the transformation was complete. The war had demonstrated that industrialized science could be converted directly into battlefield dominance, compressing the time between invention and impact to a matter of months. The proximity fuse was one of the clearest manifestations of this process. A device that began as a laboratory concept and ended as a decisive factor in one of the war's largest battles. In historical perspective, its significance extends beyond World War II. It marked the beginning of a new paradigm in which weapons would increasingly incorporate sensing, decision-making, and automation. The principle that a munition could detect its environment and act independently became the foundation for guided missiles, smart bombs, and modern precision warfare. What began in the Ardennes as a solution to a tactical problem evolved into a defining characteristic of modern military power. The final conclusion is unavoidable. Wars are no longer decided solely on the battlefield. They are decided in laboratories, factories, and supply chains long before the first shot is fired. In December 1944, when shells began detonating in the air above German troops, that reality became visible in its most lethal form. From that moment forward, victory belonged to those who could not only fight, but innovate, produce, and deploy faster than their enemy could comprehend. By the time the last artillery barrages fell silent, the transformation was no longer confined to a single battlefield or even a single campaign. The proximity fuse had revealed a new equation of war, one in which lethality could be engineered, scaled, and applied with mathematical certainty. What had begun on December 16, 1944, as an unauthorized decision by a field commander had evolved into a systemic advantage that no opposing force could counter in time. The battlefield was no longer governed by visibility, terrain, or even experience. It was governed by detection, timing, and industrial output. For the German army, this realization came too late. Their doctrine had been built on maneuver, concentration, and exploitation, principles that required predictable interactions between forces. Proximity-fused artillery shattered that predictability. Assault formations could no longer mass without catastrophic risk. Defensive positions could no longer guarantee protection. Movement itself became a liability, as any detectable presence could trigger destruction from above. The very logic of their operational art, refined over years of war, was rendered obsolete within weeks. On the Allied side, the lesson was absorbed immediately. Technology was not an auxiliary element of warfare, it was its foundation. The integration of scientific research, industrial production, and tactical deployment had produced a weapon that multiplied effectiveness without increasing manpower. This model would define future military planning. Success would no longer depend solely on how armies fought, but on how quickly they could adapt, innovate, and scale new capabilities across entire fronts. The numbers behind this shift underscored its permanence. Over 22 million proximity fuses were produced during the war, with hundreds of thousands deployed in the Ardennes alone. Each unit represented a convergence of materials, engineering, and logistics that no short-term effort could replicate. The cost had fallen from $732 to $18 per unit, not through compromise, but through industrial refinement. This was not just superiority, it was sustainability, the ability to maintain technological dominance continuously rather than achieve it briefly. In the end, the meaning of the Ardennes extended far beyond the outcome of the battle itself. It demonstrated that the decisive factor in modern war was not simply who could fight harder, but who could think, build, and deploy faster. The proximity fuse was a single device, but it represented an entire system of warfare, one in which knowledge became firepower and production became strategy. From that point forward, the side capable of transforming innovation into immediate battlefield effect would hold the advantage not just in one campaign, but in every conflict that followed. The implications of this shift extended far beyond 1945, shaping the structure of every modern conflict that followed. The proximity fuse introduced a principle that would become central to military thinking. Weapons could operate independently of direct human control at the moment of impact. Instead of relying on observation, correction, and timing calculated by crews, the munition itself became the decision-maker. This transition, from human-guided destruction to sensor-driven automation, marked the beginning of a new era in which speed, precision, and autonomy defined effectiveness. In the decades after the war, this principle evolved rapidly. Radar-guided systems, infrared seekers, and later digital targeting platforms all traced their conceptual origins to the same idea first realized in those artillery shells over the Ardennes. The proximity fuse proved that even under extreme conditions, 20,000 G acceleration, high rotation, and temperature extremes, electronics could function reliably in combat. This breakthrough removed a fundamental barrier, opening the path toward increasingly complex and capable systems that would dominate late 20th and 21st century warfare. For military planners, the lesson was clear and enduring. Technological superiority did not merely enhance existing capabilities, it redefined them. A single innovation, if properly integrated and produced at scale, could invalidate entire categories of tactics and doctrine. The Ardennes demonstrated that armies unprepared for such shifts could find themselves outmatched not gradually, but suddenly as familiar methods ceased to work without warning. At the strategic level, this transformation reinforced a broader reality that had emerged throughout World War II. Industrial capacity, scientific research, and logistical coordination were no longer supporting elements of war, they were its core. The side capable of sustaining innovation, distributing it rapidly, and applying it consistently would determine the pace and outcome of conflict. The proximity fuse was not the only example of this principle, but it was among the clearest, compressing the entire process, from concept to decisive battlefield impact, into a single campaign. The story ultimately resolves into a final, unambiguous conclusion. Warfare had crossed a threshold. From that point forward, victory would belong not to those who simply endured or maneuvered more effectively, but to those who could transform knowledge into power faster than their adversaries could react. In the winter of 1944, beneath the exploding airbursts over the Ardennes, that reality became impossible to ignore. And yet, within that transformation, one detail remained constant: the human cost that underpinned every technological advance. Behind each proximity-fused shell were not only engineers and factories, but soldiers who experienced its effects in the most immediate way possible. German infantrymen advancing through snow-covered forests faced destruction that arrived without warning and offered no visible enemy to fight. American artillery crews, often operating for hours without pause, delivered firepower on a scale that would have been unimaginable just years earlier. The distance between those who created the weapon and those who endured it had never been greater, yet their roles were inseparably linked. This gap between cause and effect became one of the defining characteristics of modern warfare. Decisions made in laboratories and production facilities translated directly into outcomes measured in seconds on the battlefield. The proximity fuse compressed the chain of action, from research to deployment to impact, into a system that operated with minimal delay. Once introduced, it required no further adjustment, no additional innovation to remain effective. Its presence alone altered behavior, forcing adaptation from an enemy that had neither the time nor the resources to respond adequately. For those who studied the war afterward, the conclusion was reinforced repeatedly. The decisive advantage did not lie in any single battle, weapon, or commander, but in the ability to sustain a continuous cycle of improvement. The proximity fuse was not an isolated success. It was one element in a broader pattern of innovation that included radar, code breaking, strategic bombing, and mechanized logistics. Together, these systems created an environment in which superiority could be maintained not through singular victories, but through constant pressure applied across every domain of conflict. By early 1945, this cumulative advantage had become overwhelming. German forces, even when fighting with determination and tactical skill, could not overcome the disparity in production, technology, and supply. Each loss weakened their position permanently, while Allied losses were absorbed and replaced. The balance was no longer dynamic. It had stabilized in favor of one side, making the final outcome a matter of time rather than possibility. The legacy of the proximity fuse, therefore, is not limited to its immediate effects. It stands as a clear demonstration of how modern war is shaped, not by isolated acts of brilliance, but by systems capable of turning knowledge into sustained, overwhelming force. In the Ardennes, that system revealed itself with unmistakable clarity. From that moment onward, the future of warfare belonged to those who could build, adapt, and deploy faster than their enemies could understand.